It's now my pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker, Jonathan Reckford. Habitat for Humanity International is an organization that since 1976 has helped, as we said, over 59 million people build or improve the place they call home. As the visionary CEO of Habitat since 2005, Jonathan has leveraged his extensive background in business and finance to significantly impact global housing needs. Today, Jonathan and his team, many of whom are with us today, have established local habitat organizations in all 50 states and over 70 countries. Habitat has grown to serving over 13.4 million people just last year. Jonathan is a Chapel Hill, North Carolina native and a proud alumnus of the University of North Carolina. His life embodies the core values of Rotary: service and leadership. His journey has taken him from the high-powered finance world at Goldman Sachs to the front lines of global nonprofit leadership, a journey that speaks volumes to his dedication to service above self. His leadership was recognized in 2017 when the Nonprofit Times named him the most influential nonprofit leader in America. His educational achievements earlier in his life include a Moorhead Scholarship at UNC, an MBA from Stanford Business School, both of which laid the foundation for a career of service to others. He's a board member of several very prestigious organizations, an author of impactful books on social change, and Jonathan continues to inspire and lead by example in the pursuit of a better world by building strength, stability, and self-reliance through housing. We're privileged to have Jonathan with us today to share his insights and leadership lessons in conversation with another highly successful fellow Rotarian, Milford McGurk. Please join me in welcoming both of them to the stage.
And John, just on logistics, do I have the clicker? Thank you so much. I might need that. Thank you, President John, for your kind words. And it's great to be with my own Rotary family. I've been out of town way too much. And welcome to some of my colleagues and friends from local Atlanta chapters around the Atlanta metro. It is wonderful to have you all here. The Habitat's vision is a world where everyone has a safe, decent, and affordable place to live. And we are working every day to realize that vision from right here in Atlanta to across the country and across the world. I had the great privilege just last week of visiting our program in Guatemala, and we hit a quite extraordinary milestone. We celebrated 1 million people with new or improved housing in Guatemala, which is quite remarkable in over 45 years. And I'm delighted to report their board chair is a Rotarian, with a partnership between Rotary Canada and the Rotary program, several Rotary programs across Guatemala. Since Habitat's founding, as you've heard now a couple of times, we've grown very fast working, and I want to focus today a little bit on some of the lessons I've learned from that and how we managed to grow. I want to share quickly about Habitat. I'm going to focus on some things that might surprise you. I think everyone knows Habitat. We've got this very well known, especially in the US, and beloved brand. But it turns out that two of the things that are best known about Habitat aren't true. So the first and most common misconception is that Jimmy Carter both started and runs Habitat. While he is neither, Habitat would have never become what it is today had President and Mrs. Carter not gotten involved. They helped in so many ways, really putting Habitat on the map as they put their time and voices to work alongside families and communities for over 35 years. In some ways, the giant inflection point for Habitat was in 1984 when President and Mrs. Carter and a busload of folks from South Georgia went up to New York City to rehab a tenement building on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And that's really when the world found out about Habitat. And President Carter, and there was a wonderful session just last month here on President Carter, is such an incredible servant leader. And one of the great privileges of my life was to observe him in action year after year. And I saw him with some of the most powerful people in the world and some of the least powerful people in the world. And he's always the same person, which is such a mark of integrity. And it is, it's hard to overstate the impact he and Mrs. Carter had on Habitat, in addition to all the other remarkable things they have done. Another misconception is that Habitat gives away houses. And for those of you who know Habitat, one of the deep, abiding values of Habitat is we build with, not for. And so from the very beginning, it's always been about partnership housing. So working with low-income families who typically had incomes too low to be able to get bank financing, and working with them side by side to build affordable houses. The families pay back an affordable mortgage that then gets recycled back into their community, giving other families a chance. And they take classes in financial management and home maintenance and put in hundreds of hours of helping build their homes and their neighbors' homes. And in that process, we call sweat equity, in lieu of a cash down payment. It's part of why I think Habitat has had such an extraordinarily low foreclosure rate and so many successful families around the world. And what we know, and I think sometimes can take for granted for those of us who all grow up in decent housing, is how foundational housing is to all the other things we hope for a child. It is so inextricably linked to health, to education, and economic opportunity. So if you care about any of those things, you have to care about housing. And housing is certainly not the only need, but in many ways it's a prerequisite for all the things we want for every child in our world. And if you don't have housing, staying healthy, doing well in school, become further and further out of reach, and then it's very hard to break out of that cycle of poverty. And what we also see very clearly now is that the absence of affordable housing also creates an economic break for communities. And we're seeing that now in historically affordable communities where it's hard to hire workers if you can't find housing. Right now, 1 in 6 families spend half or more of their income on housing. And you think about all the implications of that. In order to afford a median price U.S. home, home buyers must now earn in the U.S. $115,000. That's about $40,000 more than a typical household earns. And that required income is up 15% from the prior year and 50% since the beginning of the pandemic, which means that all sorts of communities, including Atlanta, that were historically affordable, are no longer affordable. This is a little bit of a shocking slide. This shows the number of homes sold under $300,000, and just in the past 15 years. And what you see is in 2022, only 10% of new homes in America were sold under $300,000. And you're seeing that in our community now when you look at house prices. And that leaves out a huge amount of our society. So faced with the housing crisis, how do we continue to make an impact? And I want to share just a few lessons I've learned from my years at Habitat. First lesson, which is one I would never wish to learn, is not to waste a crisis. And lots have learned from this. I joined Habitat with remarkable timing in August of 2005. And if you remember, I got the job, and about a week before I was officially going to start at Habitat, Hurricane Katrina hit the Gulf Coast of the U.S., one of the largest housing disasters in U.S. history. Habitat was already trying to wrestle with responding to the Indian Ocean tsunami, which had devastated multiple countries in December of 2004. Entire communities were washed away. Millions of people had no place to live, and we had to completely rethink our approach to helping families in need of shelter. We were designed to build a few houses in a huge number of places. Suddenly we needed to do a lot of building in a few places, and we learned so much through the recovery process. And in a way, because of the level of the crisis, both because we raised a lot of funds and the urgency of the need, we were able to do some cultural changes and tip some sacred cows that might not have been possible without that level of need. In Asia, we built 25,000 homes in the first 5 years after the tsunami, which was a level of scale far greater than anything we'd ever done in the region, and in some ways laid the seeds for our future growth strategy. In the Gulf Coast, we started right away, just a few weeks after building the first house in Louisiana. And we worked with 21 local affiliates to help recovery efforts from Mississippi to Louisiana, Alabama, and Texas. And before the hurricanes, Habitat affiliates had been building about 57 homes a year across the entire region. In the years following, we helped 6,000 families rebuild. And that taught us so much about how to scale. In each of those crises, our mission and the need compelled the response, but the unprecedented response also changed our view of what was possible. And I would say now, the current affordability crisis leads to the next lesson, and this has been so important in our growth. We should be religious about our principles, but not our tactics. And I think sometimes in tough change times, people get confused, and you see violent disagreement because one person is defending a principle, and for someone else, it's changing a tactic. Habitat had been growing really fast, but our vision was everyone. Everyone's a really big number. And we actually calculated, if we continue our current growth rate, how long would it take to actually achieve our vision of everyone having decent housing in the world? And I think the math was something like 1,032 years, which felt really slow. So we actually changed our framing question from how many houses can we build, which was a really good question, to what would it take to meaningfully address the housing need in every geography that we serve, which was actually a much scarier question. That meant looking at housing systems and how to impact markets. And I got behind. We started, if you think about, it all begins with land. And it may surprise you that across the world, there are so many places where women and marginalized groups don't have the right to own their land or their property. And so we started a global advocacy campaign called Solid Ground to advance property rights for women and marginalized groups and made meaningful changes in over 30 countries. And this is an essential starting point because it doesn't make sense to upgrade your housing if you don't know that you can stay on your land. This is an amazing power group of women, and we did a 5-year effort to train this group of women and a number of others in Bolivia on how to advocate for their rights. In Bolivia, women did not have the right to own land or property. And if you think about the implications of that for divorce, inheritance, just having a financial asset or abuse, it can become such a trap. This powerhouse group of women not only got the right to their own land, they got the federal law changed so that if a man was married and wanted to register his land or house, it had to be joint titled. So that to me is a wonderful example of changing the enabling environment. That meant 1.8 million women suddenly had the right to become property holders. Now, we wouldn't declare real success till all of them actually got their titles, but it's an example of change. If you go past property rights, the next step is finance. And in most of the countries we serve, only about 5% of families could obtain a bank loan for housing or a mortgage. So that means if you wanted to upgrade your house, moneylenders or family were really the only possible options. And we made a big bet that there was a market opportunity for the microfinance industry to start doing home improvement lending. And we started by experimenting with our own capital, and our early tests were really encouraging. Our flagship example of this we called the Microbuild Fund. And in 2012, we raised a $100 million fund, and it's already made a pretty extraordinary impact. So it's now provided more than $240 million in wholesale capital to 62 microfinance institutions across 33 countries. What's really exciting if you see this, it was 10 million of equity, 90 million of debt. It's now had 1.5 cycles, so it's loaned out over 230 million. What we love, which is showing the market is starting to work, is the microfinance institutions that we trained have now put in 1.1 billion of their own capital into housing lending. So the fund has directly helped over 1 million people. Now 1.1 million people have access to housing loans. But it's now helping millions more because the market is now recognizing an opportunity and starting to serve that. This fund, the debt came from the Development Finance Corporation in the US, and when they started measuring both financial return and social return, the fund got the highest rating on social return of anything they've ever measured. And we're now trying to raise a much larger $500 million fund to continue to grow the work. So if you can stay on your land and get a loan, the next question is, what do you do with the loan? How do you get value in terms of building materials? So through our Center for Innovation and Shelter in each region of the world, we run shelter tech programs, helping entrepreneurs who are coming up with better building materials for very low income families and helping them get to market. Just an example, We're one of the first investors in Tavasta, an Indian company that built the first 3D printed homes in India and is now actually going to come to the U.S. Our Shelter Venture Fund also invests in entrepreneurs who are coming up with better materials. One investee we're really excited about is Burn. It's a Kenyan social enterprise that is trying to reduce deforestation through the design, manufacturing, distribution of clean cook stoves in sub-Saharan Africa. And they've now sold millions of stoves with a significant health impact for families that are moving away from kerosene and wood. So if you can now get better building materials, you can get a loan. The last step is, how do you actually know how to manage a project? And this is one of the thorniest, because you can scale financing much faster than you can scale local technical assistance to the families. And we've tried all kinds. We've bundled it with loans. We have done direct training. And something interesting, too early to declare full victory, but we're actually doing home improvement television in the Philippines, Kenya, and Peru, and reaching millions of people through web-based TV, and it's entertainment on how to fix up your home and make good decisions with your housing loan. So through that, trying to make the entire housing value chain work better, so ultimately families can access the market without help, because the market would actually work for them. And I share those global examples because I would argue now the market is broken in the U.S. When we started a lot of this work, the housing market in the U.S. largely provided enough housing for most of our population at rates they could afford. Certainly not perfectly, and same for most of the global north. In the last 5 years in particular, that has gotten wildly out of whack. So it is one last initiative I want to share just to show the power of housing. We started a campaign in Latin America a couple years ago called 100,000 Floors to Play On. And even in Guatemala, where I was just there, 1 in 4 families in Guatemala still have a dirt floor in their house. And you think it's pretty staggering, the health implications of just a $500 or $1,000 investment to get a family off a dirt floor onto a cement floor. The health impact for early childhood development and health, just being on a cement floor includes an 81% reduction in anemia. And this is the most staggering. Cognitive development impact of children going from 36% to 96%. Because you think about the implications of being able to crawl, being able to move, being able to learn. So pretty breathtaking health impact from a relatively small intervention. And so far we've replaced about 10,000 floors in the region, but we have a long way to go. It is, so if we turn to the U.S., I want to look briefly at one more principle, which is the importance of partnerships. Because housing is complicated, and there is no magic bullet that will solve the affordable housing crisis. It's going to take a multi-sector approach with public sector, private sector, and social sector working together. And the axiom I've learned is that the only thing worse than partnering is not partnering. So partnering is slow, cumbersome. There are extra grace required people involved. It is not every partner is perfect, including us. But it's the only way to get to the kind of solutions that are sustainable, particularly when it comes to housing. And that partnership has to start with the community. That again, back to that principle of doing with, not for, that the community's got to own the vision for change. And then we need to figure out how do we come alongside and move that into real progress. And sometimes that means Habitat joining an existing effort. The West Side work in Atlanta is a great example of that. And Atlanta Habitat is proud to be a partner of a much bigger effort. Sometimes Habitat has led the effort. And I want to share just one example because one of the big moves in the U.S. has been Habitat moving from being a builder of single houses to becoming a neighborhood developer, a community developer, and also an agent in neighborhood revitalization of historically underserved communities. And I want to talk about the Cherry Street community, this is in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Really well located, historic African-American community that had been going downhill for decades, significantly underinvested. And when we talked to the families, they had two priorities. They wanted young families to start moving back into the neighborhood as opposed to escaping whenever they could. And they wanted to do something about the crime. It was an unsafe neighborhood. And the affiliate in Forsyth County announced a commitment to replace 16 of the most empty, dilapidated homes right at the front of the community with new homes. And based on that commitment, some private developers said they would buy up and rehab homes and put them on the market. And some other players came in to do affordable rental and in the market as well. And that started a big chain of partnerships with all the local universities, with the schools, with the city, with a new charter school was opened in the community. And when I was there after 2 years, this is the front of the community when Habitat started. This is the exact same angle 3 years later. And when I came to visit, a policeman named Billy, who was volunteering in the community, said, if you'd been here 2 years ago, I would have been here to protect you. He said, now look what we've done. And crime was already down 70%. The school was opening. Habitat then built another 100 homes. They extended from 4 blocks to 16 blocks. Habitat actually moved into the neighborhood. They extended the family training support to all the families in the neighborhood, not just the ones buying Habitat homes. And they actually moved their Restore in and created a tool lending library for any families that wanted to upgrade their own housing to give them support. And it's just an example of how change can happen when everyone comes together. Nothing easy about it, but it is. And how many of you have ever volunteered with Habitat? I know, that's awesome. That makes me so happy. Now, I'm going to say this with the deepest respect. Some of you may be amazing at construction. Some of you may, like me, be just okay at construction and can follow directions. And one of the mental model shifts was moving our volunteers from a construction strategy to a social change strategy. And the reason that's so important is because what we know we need are hearts and minds and voices, and sometimes checkbooks too. But that the goal, sometimes when people come and volunteer, it may be the first time they've even been in another part of their own community, and the first time they've meaningfully interacted with people outside their socioeconomic class, which is sometimes the biggest divide we have. And so it is our goal, if you think about sort of the virtuous circle, is people come out and have that volunteer experience, we hopefully grab their hearts. They can see the impact in a very tangible way of housing. And then we hope they will become those yes in my backyard folks who will then start becoming a place that has better welcoming housing policies, that makes housing a priority, and therefore creates an environment where the market can provide more housing, and therefore Habitat and other builders can build more housing, and we can start that virtual circle. So it's, I just want to close with a huge thank you. I realize I am preaching to the choir now, but I remember that when we talk about millions and millions, every one of those numbers represents a family. And I just want to close with a brief story. This is my friend Boris, and because it's so good to remember. And Boris and I are going to keynote together at a national conference next week. And Boris is from Charlotte, North Carolina. And Boris lived in a neighborhood called The Hole, in a little shack with no indoor plumbing. And you can imagine how great that was. Gunshots, unsafe, and Boris was struggling in school. And he tells the story much better, but when he was in 3rd grade, his mom qualified to purchase a Habitat home in Optimus Park. I love the imagery of that. The family moved from The Hole to Optimus Park. And it turned out Boris was not doing well in school, but he was a bright kid. And now he had stability. He had some adults who looked out for him. He had community, and he started to really thrive. Fast forward, full scholarship to Davidson College, MBA, successful banking career, and now he helps lead a nonprofit in Charlotte, providing better services and housing to the elderly. And he makes the world a much better place. He also serves on our international board of directors. And I celebrate that, but I share it because the practical reality is just think of all the other little boys and girls who have all that potential and just need that chance, that opportunity to grow into all that God intends for her, for him. And so I love that Rotary is so engaged in all of that. Thank you for that, and now I think we're going to turn it into a conversation. Thank you very much.
All right, I don't think you need me, Jonathan. I think you covered everything that I had in terms of questions, but one of mine was the number of folks that have volunteered for a volunteer bill, that participate in a volunteer bill. And I tell you, when I was at KPMG, some of my colleagues are here, that was one of the things that we did. And me going in terms of feeling inadequate about my carpentry skills, that's one of the things God gifts that I've missed. But I tell you, they make it really easy for you there. I think also the ability to team build, to have your teams working together on something for a common purpose is really outstanding in that regard. And I tell you, if you're installing insulation, make sure you wear long sleeves and long pants, because
That's a tough job. That must have been hazing you.
Yeah. And then the final piece too I'll touch on is the emotional element of the dedication of the home to the person that's going to take it over. That is really something that really sticks with you as well. So just a couple of questions. I know we're running on time, Jonathan, but I just want to touch on a couple of questions with you in terms of your personal experience. One of the things President Yates wants us to get out of these meetings is leadership lessons, and I want to make sure I touch on that. So you spent a number of years, I know you went to UNC Chapel Hill, you went to Stanford Business School, and then you started with Goldman Sachs, and your career could have gone in a whole different direction, making a lot of money, doing a lot of different things. You spent time with a number of different companies like Best Buy, Circuit City, Walt Disney Company, Marriott, and I was just curious, you spent time with them, but you actually got locked in at Habitat for Humanity. You've been there almost 20 years. Talk about the leadership experiences that you've developed over those other companies you work with, and what is it about Habitat that made you stick?
Thank you. You know, my career actually never made much sense to me. And I look back and I can see how all of the pieces turned out to be incredibly valuable in preparation. And I can pull some themes out. Actually, the sequence is a little bit different. I was going to go to law school and go into politics and realized I had no interest in being a lawyer. That's just what I thought you needed to do. So I had to come up with a plan, talk my way into Goldman Sachs with no preparation whatsoever, with the hubris of the line that I would learn finance faster than I could teach other people how to communicate, which turned out not to be fully accurate. And I learned a huge amount, but also learned I probably wasn't cut out to be an investment banker. And a big inflection point was actually before business school, went off to Korea and spent a year doing marketing work for the Seoul Olympics. They were hosting the Olympics. And then through a longer story I won't tell, ended up coaching the Korean rowing team, which is kind of like the Jamaican bobsled team. They only qualified because they were the host country. But that's where God really grabbed my heart. And that year of living in the training camp with all the Korean coaches and athletes took me away from anything that was familiar. And I had the chance to really reflect. So I went to business school with the intent actually of going into nonprofit service. But when I got back then, only Stanford and Yale believed we needed professional management nonprofits, which seems so strange now because that's such a mainstream view. And then there weren't a lot of tracks to go straight into nonprofit work. So my new thesis was I'll go learn in the business world and then bring those skills. And I think if there was, two themes in the, I went to Marriott and then Disney, and I helped start new businesses and worked in strategy and learned a lot, but both jobs had a huge real estate component. And then ended up in retail, which was the most unexpected. Circuit City was starting CarMax, and I just thought that was fascinating to disrupt the car business, but was kind of an accidental retailer. And then ended up being president of another entertainment retail chain. If you remember, young people actually used to go to the mall and buy plastic discs. Some of you actually might have even done that long ago. But Best Buy bought that company, and that's when I thought, okay, I've waited way too long. And I think the lesson I really learned that was probably the hardest lesson is who before what. And when I left Best Buy, I was on fire to go, find my mission that mattered, and turned down a couple of really good business opportunities, and suddenly all the doors shut. And that was a really good time for personal development, great for my family, tough for my ego. But what I really heard was God was more concerned with my character than my job, focus on that. And my volunteer work had been helping churches grow. And to my great surprise, I ended up being asked by my local church to basically run the church. And everyone I trusted with career advice said, don't do that, which was scary. But we really felt that's what I was supposed to do. And now I look back, and the combination of the waiting plus the church time was the perfect complement to my corporate work to be ready when Habitat came calling when I wasn't looking. But I can honestly say, I got to Habitat, and I have not looked for a job ever since. I really felt like I found my calling. My favorite definition of vocation, free extra, is from theologian Frederick Buechner, who said, your calling or vocation is that place where the deep gladness of your heart meets the world's great need. And I think that's such a lovely description of what we're all supposed to chase after.
Yeah. So going back to your comments, your prepared comments, Jonathan, you talked about housing affordability, which I think has gotten more challenging in the current environment. So someone once said, the problem with the future is it hasn't happened yet. and some of y'all get down on the ride home today. But tell our audience what you think about this U.S. housing crisis and how, when do you think it will sort of moderate and how?
Yeah, we could spend a month on this one, and it is, the short answer is we underbuilt. After the '08 crisis, the small builders largely went out of business and couldn't get recapitalized. The credit windows shrunk for the banks, so the big builders came back, but we underbuilt for 12, 13 years, and therefore you had a growing supply challenge. Then the pandemic just came and created a complete crisis. Supply chain interruptions, building slowed down, and demand skyrocketed. Everybody suddenly wanted more house to get through the pandemic. And so, it's always been tough for us in Honolulu or California or New York City. What's been really shocking is that Charlotte, North Carolina, housing prices have doubled in 5 years. You've seen Atlanta. Tampa, they're up 250%, Austin 300%, crazy extensions where incomes are up just a little bit. So the simple answer that is not at all simple is we have to build a lot more housing, and we need to build a lot more entry level and affordable housing. And there's nothing easy about that, but it's really going to take a multi-sector approach, as I mentioned before, because without building more, what you're seeing is there's so many people chasing a small inventory that the prices just keep going up. And then on top of that, if you have a 3% mortgage, you're not going to sell. So the market is kind of frozen for a huge amount of the traditional resale market.
Yeah. And you touched on this comment too regarding social determinants in terms of people, quality, safety, affordability, neighborhoods, and economic inequality. So touch a little bit about what you think policymakers should be considering as we think about housing being a major component of social determinants for individuals.
It's so big, and part of it, the way we budget, I think, can get in the way of it. So long ago, I was on a panel with the health minister from New Zealand, and he made such an interesting comment that stuck with me. He said the best ROI on health for New Zealand would be to invest in upgrading and winterizing housing for elderly across the country. We would save so much money that we spend on treating tuberculosis and pneumonia and all these other illnesses. But their budgets didn't work very well for that. And I think if we could link, it would be easier to justify more investment in housing when you look at all the benefits. When we get a family and they move into home ownership, and not everybody should be a homeowner, but suddenly they're a taxpayer instead of a drawing subsidy, and then they're freeing up more units. And what we know, when you look at and Atlanta lives right in the middle of this. Friends in Charlotte, I think, are the only market below us, but of the top 50 markets for social mobility, Atlanta was 49 and Charlotte was 50. Two historically affordable markets, but deeply segregated, economically segregated, which correlates with racial segregation, but it's actually the economic segregation at the heart of it, which means if you're a low-income child in Atlanta and you live in a mixed-income part of Atlanta, social mobility actually looks really good. But if you live in an area of concentrated poverty, it takes a minor miracle to bust out. And what we've seen when you look at the wealth gap is most of the wealth gap until you get to significant wealth is explained by people who've had the opportunity for that long-term savings through home ownership versus those who haven't. And so again, housing shouldn't be seen as an investment, and that's part of why things I think part of why the economics are out of whack is too many people are thinking about housing only as a financial investment rather than as a place to stay. But the long-term savings of owning a home is how generations of folks moved into the middle class. And so we think it's a key piece of the puzzle.
Yeah. So I was reading an article in the AJC yesterday about Clark Howard, and he built his 100th home, I believe, and was concerned about it because Clark had a little bit of a health issue that might have disturbed that, but he and his wife completed that. Tell us what we need to know about Clark and his commitment to Habitat.
He's just a great human being. I actually went to that dedication of the 100th house last Saturday because I love Clark, and he and I share that frugal view that, I want to pinch every penny for Habitat and personally, and Clark has been incredibly generous. And you think about one person using his platform has personally sponsored 100 Habitat houses, mostly Atlanta, but also in a number of other markets where he's had radio shows and other pieces. And the lovely part, which I think is part of God's economy, is it makes him so happy. And it's, I think we all have learned, and it's so deeply embedded in the Rotary values that when we have that chance to give and see impact, we get more out of it than what we're able to put in. But it was lovely. His whole family was out, and part of a great neighborhood called Browns Mill, where Atlanta Habitat is building a mixed income neighborhood of a couple hundred houses. That's just a great community.
Right. So we're winding down. If there's any questions from the audience, please come up to the mic. I know President Yates is coming up. So I'm going to ask you just more of a personal question here in terms of you and Ashley, 3 children. Tell us a little bit about how you unwind outside of work. What do you like to do outside of work? What keeps you going?
So, I laugh. We are a big UNC family, so Carolina basketball is a deep passion. I know that starts a theological battle with some people. But if God is not a Tar Heel, why is the sky Carolina blue? It is. But for me, exercise and family stuff are kind of how I keep balanced, and then and church time.
Beautiful. All right, we got some questions.
Yes. Thank you for framing more broadly what you've been up to all these years, because I've always been a big believer of the mission, but as a sort of a zoning and public policy lawyer, I've often been aware of the conflict when there's got to be when the model was just sort of find a lot, build a house. So how have you helped your local affiliates in the U.S. move from that model to more the mixed income, community building, be part of a community, not just find a lot and build a house?
You know, it's Habitat's federated, which adds another layer of complexity, and we've got some of our wonderful affiliates here in the room. You know, the great strength of that is it's local, and housing is inherently local, so it's really important that it's locally owned, and we're in over 1,000 communities across the U.S. The challenge of that sometimes is you've got 1,000 different points of view on every issue. But I think what helps, 2 things. One is what stories you tell. So lifting up and celebrating bright spots and showing the impact in one community, because then people start watching it. 2, we have a lot of training and support and materials to help, because sometimes it's not a mindset issue, which is a big change, but then it's also a resource issue. I would like to do this, I don't know how to do this, or I don't have the skills to do it. So we do a lot of work to train and resource the affiliates and give them best practices on how to make some of those changes. But much longer story, but I do think sometimes it is finding the exemplars who are out in the front and slowly bringing the curve and focus on the middle. You know, it takes an awful lot of energy to focus on the last group, but if you can move that large middle forward, then you start to see the change happen.
Great. Thanks for all you do, just simply put. But I'd like to come back to your comment on the larger financing fund that you're pulling together. Systems change is absolutely critical, and also your comment about partnerships. Could you go a little deeper into that? You know, where is it aiming? What partners do you have? Who do you want to have? Where are you in that stage? What else do you need to kick that thing off?
Oh, that's great. Thank you. That's such a... I would pay you to ask that question. The fund we're about to go public. We are negotiating. We have most of the debt lined up. So actually, for anyone who knows anyone, or anybody who wants to be an equity investor and make a little bit of money and make a lot of impact, we're really looking for that world, because we need to raise technical assistance funds as well as equity for the next launch. And the target is primarily to scale what we've been doing with Microbuild 1, which is, so target our low and middle income contexts around the world where the housing markets are not providing enough housing finance. And the goal is, these are not full mortgages, but they're home improvement loans for very low income families that might let you get a cement floor, a proper roof, add a room to your house, get water hooked up, get proper sanitation. And over time, the goal is that family would get to have a home that would meet all the criteria, but on terms they can afford. And then and we also want to test micro mortgages, because we think there is a market for, like in Guatemala, I just met a family who borrowed enough money from Habitat in this case to be able to buy land and purchase and build a home. In Guatemala, that was a $25,000 loan. That's a different category than a $1,000 home improvement loan. But we do think there is a market for that group as well, and banks still don't lend to that group. We think the win there is to teach the banking industry that they should lend to that group, because I think that's a market opportunity, but we want to demonstrate that. So the next step for us is raising equity and technical assistance funds with the hope of a first close by the beginning of next calendar year.
Jim, I think you've got the last question.
You know, we have a large Ghanaian chamber here. said any of this to them? Because they haven't brought any of this up to me, and I do a lot of work.
Might repeat the question there, if you could, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. Sadly, and this is one of the saddest things, we actually, Habitat went super wide, and then we've actually been going narrower and deeper rather than even further wide. So we no longer work in Ghana or Nigeria, though we do housing microfinance work in Ghana through partners. We don't have a Habitat program.
Very active. She's actually bringing the ex-president to Atlanta.
So we have a wonderful group of organizational folks here that I think Jonathan, like Jim and others, can be of assistance. There's some great leadership lessons here that we've heard from Jonathan. Pick the right people to follow and allow them to speak into your life. Who before what? A very interesting comment. Character first, then vocation. Be religious about your principles, but not your tactics. Great leadership lessons for us to follow. Jonathan, I want to thank you and your team as well. Let's give all of them a hand, please. Please remember our program next week and meeting adjourned.